finished listening to the audio of the two latest Jenn Soto interviews that were gotten hold of by The Docket, Plunder and Grey Hughes. And yeah, I do want to give a huge shout out to those three creators for everything they've done so that the rest of us can listen to all these interviews, look at all these documents, etc. I also want to give a huge shout out to Gavin Fish, who's also done a lot of work with FOIA reports. And if you wanted to get actual copies of documents and things, or copies of audio, he does have a Patreon account where you can access just so many documents, audio, etc. relating to the Maddie Soto case. It is quite cheap. For me, in Australia, I think it costs me about $5 a month, but that is more expensive than what Americans pay just because of the strength of the dollar. So, huge shout out to Gavin Fish for making all that stuff available. But for this particular video, the thank you goes to The Docket. So I've listened to the audio that he put out of the Jenn Soto interviews a few times now. And I have made note of timestamps, things that I want to go back to, audio that I specifically want to address. But the purpose of this video is to talk about my overall impression. What I think, having listened through this a few times. And I think many of us sit on the fence a bit sometimes with Jenn. Is she complicit in all this? Or is she just completely stoned out of her brain and totally clueless? Now, one of the really significant things that stood out for me with Jenn Soto, and I will go into it more deeply in another video, but she talks about her own experience of having gone to a bar, being picked up by a guy, and apparently went back to his place and things didn't go so well. Now, she also, as part of that, says that she doesn't trust men. And yet, here she is, for however how long it's been going on, allowing her boyfriend to share a bed with her daughter, and to share a bed with her daughter without her present. To me, that says this woman had to have known what was going on. She's clued in enough because she's had experiences of her own. She's clued in enough to say, I don't trust men. And yet at the same time, she allows her daughter to sleep in the same bed with a grown-ass man. That to me is a huge red flag, and that says to me that she did know something. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is her emotions. And this is one that I struggled with in terms of, was she genuine or not? Now, the way it comes across listening to these videos is that she is so unemotional. And in fact, in one of the interviews, one of the officers actually calls her out on it. And he points out that he hasn't seen tears from her. And part of her response from that is, well, what do you want from me? How should, she's essentially asking, how should I be behaving then? Which was interesting. But the thing that I found most interesting about that was that then straight after that part of the interview where he's called her out about her lack of emotion, the way she's talking to me sounds like she is trying really hard to work herself up into an emotional reaction. And I will be doing a video specifically on this particular part. But to me, it sounds like this woman was unable to show emotion here. There's a few times when she appeared to start to react emotionally and then switched it off. And then when she's called out on it, why no tears? The question is, how do you want me to react? And then straight after that, you have her essentially talking herself into an emotional reaction, which is how it sounds to me. Now, you can look at this a few different ways. We know that she was on a lot of medications. And we know that a lot of those medications were for anxiety, for bipolar, etc. Medications that tend to level your emotional reactions. So it is quite possible that the part of her brain which controls emotional reactions was essentially being blocked by the medications that she was on. And so she wasn't showing true emotions because of that. Now, you could argue that perhaps she was in shock because the part where they're questioning her reactions is just after they've shown her photos of Maddie in Stearns' car and said, we don't think she was sleeping. And she has a very brief reaction and then squashes it down. Now, you could argue that the lack of reaction is a shock response. But to me, what I would expect in terms of a shock response in that instance would be a complete, utter meltdown. You can't tell me... Now, this is why her daughter is still missing. You can't tell me that she hasn't considered different scenarios. But she seems to, when they suggest that her boyfriend may have been responsible and that these photos they're showing her may be her daughter already deceased, she really doesn't seem to react in the way that I would expect. Now, like I said, it could be that the medications are blocking the part of the brain that controls emotions. But here's the thing where I have trouble with that. And that is, at one point, she does appear to suddenly become really, really emotional. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of she appears to become really emotional and then she gets it in check really quickly. Which to me says that, and I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I don't have any medical knowledge of all this, so please feel free to correct me or share your opinions on this. But the fact that she can squash that down says to me that that part of her brain is not being essentially immobilised by medication, because otherwise there would be no emotion whatsoever. If her medications were blocking the part of the brain that controlled emotion, then you would expect no emotion whatsoever, is what I believe. Like I said, correct me if I am wrong with this. So the fact that she does have this sudden reaction and then switches it off, to me, is a red flag. Is it that she is reacting because she thinks she has to react here? Or is it a genuine reaction? And is it a reaction because she's been covering for her boyfriend and now she realises that they know what's going on? Or is it a reaction because she suddenly realised that, wow, this shit just got real? and she suddenly realised that her daughter is deceased. Now, she says that she has bipolar. She also says that she has ADHD. Now, I haven't done enough research into bipolar to really know the ins and outs of it. But I believe that it is still a neurological disorder. In other words, part of the brain is affected. So I don't know if the part of the brain that is affected with bipolar, but you would think it would be the part of the brain that controls emotion, because people who have bipolar have highs and they have lows, and they swing between them. Sometimes it can be a slow swing, sometimes they can swing really quickly between their highs and lows. So to me that says that bipolar is similar to ADHD in that a person with one of those disorders is unable to regulate emotions. What does that mean? That means that if you suddenly get a shock and you suddenly start having this major crying response, then I would expect that you are going to just completely melt down and be unable to get it back in check. Now, I'm looking at this from an ADHD perspective because I know that emotional dysregulation is a major thing for people with ADHD. And if you tip over into that point of emotional distress to the level where it appeared that she was showing us, then that part of the brain pretty much just locks up and you can't stop that emotional distress. So for someone with ADHD, I would have expected that as soon as that emotion was switched on, that she would have been utterly incapable of switching it off again. And that they probably would have had to shut down the interview for an hour. And trust me, I've been there. I've had those emotional responses where you just couldn't shut it off, and where it's taken an hour before you could start regulating again. It is one of the horrible things that comes with having ADHD. Like I said, I'm not overly familiar with bipolar, but given that it is also something to do with emotional regulation, I would imagine a similar response. And I'm going to say that in terms of Jen, I would like to hear from people who actually know for certain, but I'm not sure that bipolar and ADHD actually are what you would normally see in terms of comorbidity. So comorbidity is basically when you have one disorder, like ADHD, and you may have another diagnosed disorder, like anxiety. So comorbidity is when two disorders exist for one person. But the thing is, I've heard so many instances of people who have bipolar being misdiagnosed with ADHD and vice versa. So it is my understanding that normally it's a diagnosis of one or the other and that they're not comorbidities. But if someone knows more about that, let me know. Like I said, I don't know a lot about bipolar. So to me, my overall impression of listening to Jenn Soto on these two interviews is that I think perhaps she may not have been fully aware of everything, maybe, or that she thought that she was covering for Stearns for some reason and that they were going to get away with it. I go back and forth. But I honestly don't believe that her emotional reactions are overly genuine. And I think there are a lot of red flags in that interview which make me think that she at least had some inkling that Stearns was guilty of something. Whether or not she believed that he had actually been responsible for Maddie's death is yet to come out. But I do think that, I believe that at the very least, she knew what was going on behind closed doors in her house with Stearns and Maddie. And there are so many comments that are made throughout this interview which to me are an indication that she did know these things. Like I said, I will break those down with the audio in subsequent videos. But in today's video, I just wanted to give my overall impression, what I think from listening to these two latest interviews. So thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, please hit the subscribe button. Also, please hit like and leave a comment below. Have you listened to these interviews? If so, what are your thoughts on Jenn Soto's emotions? What are your thoughts on how much she knew?